The sound of screeching tires and shattering glass filled the busy city street as a black luxury sedan came to a jarring stop. A moment of silence followed before people on the sidewalk turned their heads, gasping at the wreck in front of them. Two uniformed officers stood frozen, their patrol car still partially pressed against the now damaged vehicle. A crowd began to gather, murmurs growing as they tried to piece together what had just happened. But the tension in the air wasn't just about the crash itself. It was about the man stepping out of the wrecked car. Dressed in a crisp suit, his presence commanded attention, but what struck the officers most was his calm demeanor. He didn't yell or panic, even as he looked at the deep dents in his vehicle. One officer, a younger cop with a nervous energy, exchanged a glance with his partner, whose hand hovered over his belt, as if preparing for the worst. The assumption was written all over their faces. They didn't know who they had just crashed into, but they were already on edge. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," the older officer ordered, his voice carrying more authority than necessary. The man simply raised an eyebrow, glancing at the wreckage before locking eyes with the officer. The way he held himself, the confidence in his stance, made something shift in the air. The crowd sensed it too. A bystander whispered, "Do they even know who he is?" Another person pulled out their phone, recording as the situation unfolded. The officers, still unaware of the full weight of their actions, seemed intent on controlling the situation. "License and registration," the younger cop demanded, his voice firm but betraying a hint of unease. The man in the suit let out a slow breath before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a leather case. He flipped it open, revealing something that made both officers' faces instantly drain of color. The crowd gasped. The officers had just wrecked the car of a federal judge, and now they were standing on the edge of a mistake that could change everything. The street fell into a stunned silence as the officers stared at the badge in front of them. The golden emblem glinted under the sunlight, the words *** United States, Federal Judge *** unmistakable. The younger officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as he slowly lowered his hand away from his belt. His partner, a seasoned cop who had dealt with his fair share of difficult situations, tried to mask his sudden panic, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The crowd, sensing something big was unfolding, pressed in closer, phones still recording. The judge didn't say a word at first. He let the moment hang, watching the officers shift uncomfortably. They had assumed they were in control, until now. His expression remained unreadable as he finally tucked his badge back into his pocket, his gaze never leaving theirs. "You're a judge?" the younger officer asked, his voice quieter than before. The man nodded. "That's correct. And now I'd like to know why you just rammed into my car." The officers hesitated. The truth was, they had made a snap decision the moment they saw his car, a luxury sedan driven by a black man in a nice suit. They had been patrolling the area when they noticed him slowing down at a red light. Something about him, made them suspicious. When he reached into his glove compartment at the stoplight, they assumed the worst. No warning, no sirens, just instant action. The next thing they knew, they had crashed into him. The older officer cleared his throat. There was a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description. A few people in the crowd scoffed. Someone muttered, "Yeah, right." The judge's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. "A stolen vehicle. I'd like to see that report." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected to be challenged like this, especially by someone with the authority to turn their entire careers upside down. Their breathing grew heavier, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The mistake had already been made. Now they had to figure out how to get out of it, if they even could. The older officer's hand hovered over his radio, hesitating. He knew there was no report of a stolen vehicle, at least not one that matched the judge's car. His pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to think fast. Meanwhile, the younger officer's face had turned pale. He wasn't just nervous. He was realizing the full weight of what they had done. The crowd, now growing restless, murmured among themselves. Some shook their heads, others recorded everything in silence. Every second that passed only made the officers look worse. The judge took a slow step forward, looking at the damage to his car. The front bumper was crumpled, the hood dented where the police cruiser had struck it. He let out a deep breath, as if holding back a storm of emotions. His car could be repaired, but this wasn't about the car. It was about the assumption, the immediate dangerous assumption that nearly got him hurt, or worse. A woman in the crowd spoke up. "So, where's the report?" The older officer ignored her, his jaw tightening. He finally pressed the button on his radio, keeping his voice as even as possible. "Dispatch, do we have any reports of a stolen black sedan in the area?" A long pause. The radio crackled. Then a voice responded, "Negative. No reports matching that description." The younger officer closed his eyes for a brief second, as if bracing for impact. The judge remained silent, but his stare sharpened. He was giving them a chance to come clean, to admit their mistake. But they didn't. Instead, the older officer squared his shoulders and cleared his throat. "There must have been a mix-up," he said, forcing a small, unconvincing chuckle. "These things happen." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "A mix-up," he repeated. His voice was calm, but the weight of it sent chills through the air. "A mix-up that could have cost me my life." The officers had no response. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. The crowd waited. The cameras recorded. The judge was giving them one last chance to make it right. But would they take it? Or would they dig themselves deeper into the lie? The older officer's grip tightened on his belt as the tension in the air became unbearable. His eyes darted between the judge, the crowd, and his partner, who stood frozen in place. The murmurs around them grew louder, some voices demanding answers, others filled with disbelief. The judge remained eerily calm, his gaze locked on the officers, waiting for them to acknowledge what they had done. Then the younger officer finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost shaky. "Sir, hi." But before he could finish, the older officer shot him a sharp look, cutting him off. His jaw clenched, his pride refusing to let him back down. The judge took a slow step forward, his presence alone commanding attention. "You had no probable cause," he said, his voice steady. "No stolen vehicle report. No crime committed. And yet you not only stopped me without justification, but you also escalated the situation by damaging my car." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me, officer, what exactly was the reason for this mix-up?" The crowd grew silent, waiting. The older officer exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "Look, this was a misunderstanding. No one got hurt, so let's not blow this out of proportion." His words only made things worse. A wave of disapproval rippled through the onlookers. No one got hurt. The judge's voice was sharp now, his patience wearing thin. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the damage on his car. "That's my property destroyed. That's my safety put at risk. And had I reacted the way any person might when being aggressively pulled over without cause, what do you think would have happened then?" The younger officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. He knew exactly what could have happened. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The crowd waited for an answer, their phones still recording, their eyes burning with expectation. The older officer looked cornered, his authority slipping. He knew that one wrong move could cost him everything. And yet, instead of admitting fault, he squared his shoulders and reached for his radio again. The judge's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He already knew what was coming next. The question was, would they truly go through with it? Would they take the situation beyond the point of no return? The older officer's fingers hovered over the radio, his face unreadable. The tension in the air thickened as the judge remained still, unshaken. The younger officer shifted uneasily, clearly torn between his training and the sinking realization that they had crossed a line. The crowd pressed in closer, their phones capturing every second, waiting for the next move. Then, just as the older officer was about to call it in, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. The door swung open, and a sharply dressed man stepped out, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with authority. His presence alone sent a ripple through the growing crowd. The officers stiffened, exchanging uncertain glances. They recognized him instantly, Chief Inspector David Carter. Carter's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the wrecked car, the surrounding witnesses, and the two officers standing in the center of it all. His gaze landed on the judge, and for a brief moment, his face darkened. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said, "What exactly is going on here?" The older officer quickly straightened. "Sir, we were conducting a routine stop when